How do you build a hospital? Why are hospitals so hard to build? In this video, we speak to a healthcare construction expert, Gordon Grover, and learn all about the hospital construction lifecycle, why hospitals are so cold, and you'll be super surprised at what the top risks are. Thanks for doing this, by the way. Kind of like to get into the nitty-gritty of some of these things. So it's not really, it's kind of, I like to get your judgment and your experience on a few things, particularly with the commercial projects. Like you guys are quite specialized in that. And I see a lot of PM firms who I guess try to, but it's like a different type of project in my view. It's a bit like a builder gets stuck doing fit outs, but they can't really cross the chasm into doing structures. Now, there is a similar difference with client-side PMs. Like it is a different type of project. So I thought I would just kind of throw it out there to you, like what is kind of different about them compared to just like a regular type of project, and why is that a specialist skill set compared to kind of, like a regular type of PM?
You're talking about these complex projects I was just talking about. Is that what you're looking to understand? Yeah. So I suppose it's understanding risk. Client-side project management is all about risk management, whether that's risk to your program, risk to your budget, risk to the quality of the build, quality of the design. That's really about risk management, and you can't really manage those risks if you don't know what they are. The only best way of knowing what those risks are and knowing how to manage them is by having done it before. Having experience is a key requirement. And you can gain that experience. You can't just walk in the door and learn that off the cuff, expect to be able to pick up some of these complex projects like PC3, PC4 labs or intensive care units, theatres, some of those highly technical and complex spaces. You can't just make it up on the run. It's not something you can drag experience from a fit-out project or an industrial project and know what's coming and know how to effectively manage it. So working for a business that's done it before, working for people that have done it before is how you build up that experience and knowledge. That's how the team at SPC has done it, whether it's through developing their experience alongside others in SPC or with previous employers.
And who had that
I started
first?
the business.
So you started the business?
And I developed that experience with a previous employer. Lots of hospital, lots of laboratory stuff. But our first employee, Peter Fraser, I was a colleague of his with a previous employer as well, and he's got very similar background and experience as well. We worked alongside each other on numerous lab and hospital projects. So two of us were capable, experienced, knowledgeable in that space, knew how to manage and deliver those projects and meet client expectations. And we've brought other people into the team that have different experiences, similar across those complex type projects. And then others have built up their experience through working on some of the projects that we've done for the clients we've got.
Right. And what's like the most complex? So, you got like, you've done Dexter's work for AMP Capital, St. Vincent's. I mean, aged care, I guess, can get very hospital-like. Distribution center. What's kind of the most complex in those?
The most
complex
groups is health, really, or laboratories come very close as well. But out of that, there's CSSDs and ICUs in health. So sterile. So that's your central sterilising unit. Sorry? So where all your theatre instruments go in to get cleaned, basically. They're full of equipment, sterilisers, washers, dryers, and then that's all integrated and monitored. So high infection control requirements. So they're generally the most complex projects I'm aware of that you can do. Generally, a hospital only has one of them. So when you're refurbishing a CSSD, you have to keep it running, otherwise the whole hospital shuts down. So trying to pull out old sterilising units or washers or whatever it is and replace it with new while keeping the whole thing operational really means a 10 or 15 stage project with a whole heap of roles and management along the way.
Life or death.
But yeah, similarly, intensive care units and theatres in hospitals are very complex just because of the integration of the equipment, the risks, the obvious risks that come along with it if you get it wrong. If pendants or equipment fails during an operation, it can be life or death. So understanding what those risks are and how to manage them through not only just a construction phase, but making sure that the designers are designing things correctly and right, and there's redundancy in the design, and there's integration between services and equipment.
So then in terms of like when would be the best stage to hire someone like specialised, that would be right up at the kind of initiation planning stage or the FISO stage? Or when do you most when would you most likely get pulled in, or when
Ideally,
do you think
right at the start,
you should get pulled in?
So that's at feasibility or business case stage. That's where we can have the greatest control over risk, going back to that knowledge of risks and how to mitigate and manage them. That's best done in the early phases of the project. Once you get to construction, if the design's done, if that's not capturing and mitigating some of your risks, it's almost too late to some extent. The earlier you get in, the earlier you can identify those risks, you can mitigate or minimise those risks as you move through the different project phases.
And how are you identifying those risks? So you kind of said earlier, experience is one thing. I'm sure people are kind of putting all of this through AI tools to generate more risks. You're probably holding a risk workshop with your clients and end users and key stakeholders. Like a lot of that would take time. You can probably get so far just from your experience, but I guess each project would be a bit different anyway. And so how are you getting those risks out in the first place? And then once you've got them, how are you integrating that into either the planning or the design stage to mitigate them?
A main focus. So almost every design meeting, every client meeting, every user group meeting, every construction meeting, there's a risk item on the agenda. We'll have risk workshops, risk management plans that are constantly reviewed. So it's a live thing that's constantly updated and managed. That's generally through these meetings. So at a feasibility or business case phase, we'll identify some of the more major risk delivery risks and design risks and workshop those with the client and how we propose to manage or completely mitigate them, or at what stage we can do that, whether it's a design risk that we need to bring in specialist engineers or consultants to work with to come up with strategies and solutions. But it's pretty much just every meeting having that front of mind, having that on the agenda, discussing those key items, keeping everybody informed and coming up with solutions together.
And so what would be an example of maybe top 5 common risks on a hospital redevelopment, or maybe even like a live environment, live hospital redevelopment? Like what would be those kind of top 5 risks?
Top 5, there's obviously keeping the hospital operational. So power, air conditioning, medical gases. Accidentally cutting or shutting down a hospital is a significant issue. So
I'd love to see the liquidated damages clause of the contractor who's signed on to that.
Yeah. So that's the most key one, and that's something that's spoken about and usually managed, not just in construction, but through the design phase as well, looking at how we can stage the works,
eliminate them entirely,
how the contractor can install and work around having to cut or use some of the services that the hospital are providing. So that's a key one. Infection control obviously is another big one, and we try and mitigate that through design as much as we can. But a lot of the time it comes down to construction methodologies as well, and there's various different strategies you can manage that. The best one is complete separation of your work zone from clinical spaces, and they use things like drop sheets and plastic and even sort of insulated temporary panel walls to keep those work zones separated from clinical areas.
Is that a works thing, or is that an end user facility thing, like designing for
that
as well? Because I imagine you probably have theatres, you probably have that same need.
There is,
in the
absolutely, yeah. So theatres are designed so that they can be cleaned easily, so they're on separate HEPA filtered mechanical systems. Yes, absolutely. The design of the ongoing infection control risk is critical, and that's why hospitals are so cold. You lie in the bed in hospital, it's always freezing because that's helping manage infection and infection control. Yeah. And that's why when you wheeled in theatre, it's even colder
I've
again.
definitely noticed it.
It's always freezing in the theatres.
Right. I have noticed that, but I didn't think that was a reason. But I guess, bacteria grows in warm environments. So
bacteria and condensation. So there's, that whole humidity control as well, particularly in theatre spaces.
Yeah. What about so you kind of had keeping the hospital running, risk of infection, I guess, during the works, and risk, I guess, in the design, which is probably a designer's responsibility, and you're probably appointing designers with experience with these types of assets. What about is there any, so obviously a work, so you need access, can't interrupt access to the hospital. Are there any others that are a bit kind of left of field that end up on the top 5 regularly?
Yeah, good question. I suppose equipment integration is one we've been really diving into lately. Yeah. So we've got part of our team guys who biomedical engineers by background. They're project managers now, but have had previous career in biomedical engineering. Yeah. And asset management in particularly large tier 1 hospital environments as well. So we've got guys on the team that really understand that, not only and able to talk to clinicians and understand the clinical language and how to convey design and construction issues to them, and then vice versa as well, from them hospital operation and infection control and other issues back to designers. But manage and understand the effective risks of integrating major medical equipment. So things like MRI machines, cath labs, theatres, and the equipment that is in them inherently has integration with ICT systems, building systems, backup power systems. So making sure that all the infrastructure is in prior to that equipment being rolled in to be able to support and connect into that, and so that those pieces of equipment can be turned on operational from day one, and there's little to no risk of failure, because that's obviously a major risk. You don't want somebody lying on the bed in theatre and your equipment failing because of some issue with integration with the ICT system or building systems.
And I guess there's not much redundancy you could put into that like there is with power. Would there be? I guess that would be a disaster if something happened at that stage. So I guess they would be testing these things, and there'd be pretty strict commissioning of that asset 100%. At the end of the life cycle.
Yeah, but knowing how to commission it, knowing what questions to ask, they're the key.
So moving from Viso through kind of planning into design, once these facilities are designed, I guess there's some consideration for the procurement of these quite complex pieces of kit. Like, I don't know if there's something you can't just go to the Bunnings of, hospital equipment and just probably get a $500,000 MRI machine sent to you the next week. How do you consider that in the design when you have like a critical path? Do you go for last year's model, or do you wait for the new models? How does the supply chain kind of play into that? Does that affect the end date? Does that affect the design? Are they talking to these suppliers through the design for availability?
No, they are 100%. So that's something that's done very early. Like if you're doing a medical imaging space and you got CTs and MRIs, understanding if it's a tenant, like it might be a Queensland X-ray that's tenanting that space, they might be procuring their equipment themselves through their own suppliers and supply agreements they've got. So engaging with those tenants, or if it's a Queensland Health managed facility, for example, and they're procuring the equipment, engaging with those people as early as possible in the design to understand what models that equipment is, getting those operation and maintenance manuals and design information to be able to design the spaces around them, making sure we've got power in the right place, making sure you've got all the other building services and systems that those pieces of equipment require sized correctly in the right location. But then to answer your question, understanding the lead time associated with the procurement of that equipment and capturing that in a detailed master program. That in a lot of cases that does drive, that is your critical path. So it's quite important, particularly when you get to a construction contract phase, to have a good understanding of what that lead time is. So you're not delaying a contractor unnecessarily and costing the client delay damages.
Yeah. So in a way, it's almost like capabilities selection first. We need this type of asset. Then you're kind of working backwards, designing around that essentially. So I guess the whole hospital industry is basically driven by and designed around the latest equipment and what's available.
Yeah, well, it's
basically.
really the first step is what are we designing? What is the purpose of the facility? If it's a theatre,
yeah.
There's standard Australian health facility guidelines on what that space looks like and what it should be sized to and what sort of equipment and requirements there are in those rooms, but they're guidelines. So if there are specialist pieces of equipment, that needs to be understood early so you can design around it. You're always designing a box or a space around what that purpose or what that use of the facility is intended to be, whether that's medical wards and it's just beds and maybe oxygen and nitrous on the wall, or whether it's a medical imaging unit or a CSSD or a theatre. Everything starts with that purpose and objective, I suppose, and you design around that.
Yeah. And you said something a minute ago that I hadn't heard of before. I guess I never did any hospitals when I was a client-side PM, but there's these Australian health facility guidelines. So they're obviously an additional layer on top of the kind of building code, but you said they're kind of guidelines as opposed to, I guess, DDA, which is, I guess that is legislated.
Well, there's the NCC, National Code of Construction, which is, legislative requirement. And this is not.
But this is not.
These are guidelines which are generally used as a starting point in the industry to design those health spaces, and it covers every sort of space from reception and triage areas to waiting rooms, medical wards, theatres, storerooms, maybe cleaners' rooms, Really?
Hospital cleaners covered must be minimum.
Exactly. Yeah, it does.
16 square meters.
And generally, like I said, that's the starting point to a design, and they mostly comply. The new greenfield sites comply mostly with those Oz HFG guidelines, but every space, like every theatre, might be doing different types of operations, so it might need to be slightly larger, or there might be a good case to make it smaller if you're doing procedures that warrant it, for example. So you can depart from those guidelines, but it's generally good practice to sort of identify what those departures are and have some good reasons documented as to why you're departing from those guidelines.
Yeah. And how are you how are you actually in your role, you get this massive stack of drawings, 50% design, 90% design, whatever it is. The guidelines are probably this thick, you've got the code. How are you actually adding value to that? Are you actually reviewing the drawings, or do you get a peer review? Like, what's kind of the project manager's role there in ensuring that design is fit for purpose? It's been vetted, and that just doesn't really fall on the shoulders of that designer that's been appointed. Like, how are you kind of representing the client?
We'll certainly do a review ourselves, utilising our experience, but we'll also coordinate sort of review sessions with the client. We'll drag in the consultants so they can present their design as well. So there can be sort of a room of stakeholders, I suppose, that are collectively reviewing, able to ask questions, challenge the design, and give everybody comfort that what has been produced is correct there's no issues and that we can proceed to the next phase or into construction with those drawings. So yeah, we'll review it, but project managers at the end of the day, we're not clinicians, or if it's a different type of project, a laboratory or a industrial facility or even office building, generally the end user is the one that needs to understand and be accepting of what that design is. And sometimes a lot of the time that means you need to have that review workshop so they can fully understand what they're looking at and what they're getting.
Yeah, it's complex. And so you guys will know enough to be dangerous, but you're not certifying anything, obviously. And so ultimately the end user, in defense, they would call it non-rejection of the design. It's it's not acceptance. It's not rejected, and that would be kind of the holding point to kind of move on to the next phase of design. Is there something like that that's happening? That what's kind of the feedback that the end users are giving to the designers or giving to you that's saying this is okay to move ahead?
Best case, it doesn't always work like this, but what we try and do is get our clients to actually put a physical signature on each design drawing.
Oh yeah, you actually get them to sign
best practice in my experience. It means they have to take some responsibility themselves for reviewing and understanding the drawing, because it's
a good idea.
The worst thing that can happen is clients skip through a design, don't really look at it, don't ask questions. It gets into construction and built, and then it's not what they were expecting. They have to be engaged.
Yeah.
Ideally, in my opinion, it's the best way of doing that is to get their physical signature, or at least an email saying, yes, we approve, or no further comments on these design documents. But yeah, it has to have their involvement and understanding in it.
So that's a bit of upward management, I guess, on your part to put the pressure on them to take this seriously. We're talking probably like hundreds of documents, probably more in some instances. Do you get them to do like the electrical drawings where they maybe don't understand it?
Yeah, no, we will.
General arrangements and
I suppose going back to the start, there's multiple phases of design which we will bring them on a journey with. Say you've got your concept design first, and there'll be user group meetings as well where specific spaces have different clinicians or different users that use them. So dragging them into design meetings, getting their input, allowing them to ask questions so that the designers can develop up that design. And the same thing will happen through the schematic design, through the detailed design, and into construction issue drawings as well. Will each at completion of each of those phases, there would generally be a review of that documentation. That can either be a desktop review by the client and the key stakeholders, or ideally it's a review workshop where we get them into the room and do a page turn and make sure they're happy with what's been produced. They'll always provide comments. Those comments are captured and managed and integrated into the next phase of the design, or we come back to them with responses as to why it can't or shouldn't be captured in the design. So it's a journey. So nothing that they see is a surprise. It makes that final review simpler and easier for them to sign off on if they've been involved in that journey. But to answer the original question, we'll go through electrical and mechanical drawings as well. Usually we won't get too technical with what's been designed, but get them to review at least, like it's important to know where lights are in theatres, for example, and what sort of temperature range and humidity control there is for the air conditioning, making sure they're happy with that sort of information. They don't need to know where the cable runs and the ductwork runs are. Those interfaces with them and what they're going to be using that space for on a day-to-day basis is important.
Yep. And who's on their side that's kind of corralling all these people? Do they often have a DM, a development manager on their side, or some internal capital projects or capital works role that's kind of interfacing with you and resourcing their side? Because there is a bit of an ask of time from the end users and the stakeholders on their side to invest in this. It's definitely going to take a big chunk of time out of their their days and probably takes whole days to do some of these design review workshops, I imagine, if for a serious facility. So who's on their side that would, I guess, be representing their interests and probably your direct client?
It's different for every client, to be honest. Sometimes it's multiple and we have to manage that and those stakeholders and those relationships.
Right.
But other times there'll be one key person, a project sponsor and a project manager that we liaise with on a day-to-day, and they'll sort of corral and manage the different stakeholders. But it's different. Like even within the same client, there might be different departments and different levels of interest from the stakeholders, and we've got to manage different numbers of them.
I guess for a business like St. Vincent's, who they actually use Mastt for their projects, they've got a rolling capital project portfolio, and so they kind of can have a full-time team who's there responsible looking after these things for the regular stuff, and then every now and then they'll get the big hospital, which really pumps up the spend, and bring in some of the external consultants to kind of manage that. So I guess it really does depend on the organization. Some of them are probably super inexperienced. Like some of the clients who are probably not doing many projects at all probably don't have much of an understanding, and you're there educating.
Absolutely. That's what I mean. Some of the more sophisticated clients like St. Vincent's, we do a lot of work with them. And there's usually one key person that we coordinate with or manage on a day-to-day basis, and they're off in the background talking to the different stakeholders in their business and pulling out the information that we've asked through a design phase or construction phase that's needed to keep progressing on an issue. But then others, it's just they might only do a new capital project once every 30 years when they've got to move into a new facility, and they don't have that capability and understanding, and it's something we've got to do a lot more stakeholder management and engagement with to make sure the project is delivered.
Yeah. Bit of a segue on that. Like how do these hospitals end up making money from these assets? And are you exposed at all to how they make that money in terms of, there's a budget that has to be hit because there's a certain ROI, or if this is not done by that time, we're going to lose excess of revenue. How much do the commercials of a hospital, which is a business, impact your role? And do you see any of that?
In the private space, definitely. Public, I suppose there's budgets that they've got to manage, and they only get a certain amount of funding for operations and capital works, so they've got to try and manage within those budgets, but it's not a profit exercise for them. And similarly, a lot of the private hospitals are non-for-profit entities as well. But in the private space, it's all about theatres and having theatres run flat out, many operations going as possible. That's where the money comes from, or a large portion of the revenue comes from. So having those theatres running, having to shut one down for a refurbishment is a big issue. I mean, the impact on that revenue, that's why when we're looking at doing refurbs on CSSDs, for example, if you're shutting that down, it shuts down theatres as well. So keeping that operational at all times during a refurbishment is incredibly important to them.
So that's the moneymaker. So what does a theatre make
You're asking
per
the wrong
hour?
person there. No, I don't know. I run the construction budgets. I'll leave the management of hospitals and how much profit they're making and how they make that profit up to them. But I do know in the private space they are struggling because their biggest expenses are in the insurance space as well. Private health insurance is not providing the income that it used to as well, which is really impacting the bottom line. A lot of them are really struggling to turn a profit or even break even at the moment. So it's hard to maintain and upgrade facilities when you're not making money to be able to set aside to do that.
Yeah, totally. I guess there's less I guess the more surgeries are now elective and not funded, which kind of hits their bottom line straight away. Have you done a bit of a dark question? Have you done like a morgue style room where they keep all the dead bodies? And is there any dead body guidelines like there is for the Australian health facility?
I'm sure there is from a model of care or clinical management perspective, I'm not aware of it, but yeah, we've certainly done morgues before, and they're quite simple projects. It's just fridges inside a large room, really. Yeah. So.
Do you find you have to appoint the right project manager on some of those projects where what you're building is, maybe not the nicest topic, like crematoriums and theatres and
there's like we'll always talk to our project managers about what the project is, and like if they've got an issue with it, like it's a pretty open workplace where they can raise any concerns and look to bring somebody else on the project. But look, the morgue stuff, you don't see bodies. You're working, and the construction is in a space where it's not operational at the time. Generally, for a morgue, you'll be building you'll have a temporary morgue elsewhere, which is in operation while you're refurbing or building the new one. And they really are. They're just big fridges that can roll in and out, plug them into the wall. It's quite sterile. Bare space. But no, there's, and even like we've done projects like abattoirs before where you've got kill rooms, which can be quite confronting to walk into. But again, in design, you're not seeing that. In construction, you're not seeing that. There's obviously a benefit in being able to see the operations of a facility and see how it works to bring into a design or a construction phase. But it's few and far between, and people can raise their hand if they've got any particular issue with some of those uncomfortable things.
Yeah. Well, I guess there's probably more uncomfortable facilities that, like a kill room, that get designed and the requirement is a bit different to some of these others. Okay, now we're kind of on a bit of a bouncing ball here. I like this where this is going. So when you finish the design, you're going to have your kind of key documents. So you obviously have your design, probably a whole stack of specs. What are the other documents that are kind of the key documents for that stage, which is before you're about to go out to the market and get a contract?
The other ones, I suppose if it's a design and construct contract, there's a principals project requirements brief, which really documents all in the name, the requirements that the principal wants to see in their facility, which may not be already documented in the design documents. And then similarly, there's a preliminary specification we generally pull together, which is around what the contractor needs to do and provide during construction, or if it's a design and construct contract during design as well, what the expectations and obligations are to do things like produce design documentation for review at certain times. They've got to provide updated programs, monthly reports. They've got to have site facilities. Like sometimes a client might want an office for themselves or a meeting room, so we can have site meetings. So it'll capture all that sort of information. And then there's obviously the contract itself that drafted in draft form so that they can understand what their contractual obligations are going to be if they actually awarded the project, and then things like tender conditions, tender forms where they can fill out pricing information and provide detail around their methodology or subcontractors that they might be looking to use.
What do you think is I've got no idea about this, but for a hospital project specifically, what is the best stage, if at all, to kind of hand over the design? Are you handing it over early, like sometimes concept or schematic, or are you handing the design over at 100% fully documented, construct only? What's the best stage?
It's different.
It depends on your experience.
Facility, to be honest. The way we look at it is, again, going back to that what are the risks and who's best to manage those risks? Is it the client that's better off managing those risks, or is it the contractor who can manage and control those risks? And that's how we sort of come up with the contract strategy, whether it's like a simple medical ward is an obvious case for a design and construct contract where you might only produce a 30 or 40% design and hand it over to the contractor to finish. But if you were to produce a 30 or 40% design for a CSSD or a intensive care unit, you're losing a lot of control in the stages of that design. So that's an example of where you would progress the design through to 80, 90% or even fully documented to make sure you're managing those risks and controlling those risks with what that end design and end product's going to be.
Yeah. What else goes into kind of the contract and I guess is it a contract? Do you call it a contract strategy or a procurement strategy?
Procurement strategy, delivery strategy. It depends on who you talk to. Yeah. It's really just about identifying, like I said before, what those risks are and how best to manage them, or can the contract be set up so that that risk share is appropriate? Yeah. Makes sense. Including as far as procurement of, like, is the procurement of some of these quite large, probably nominated products, like this is a GE ultrasound device, there's 10 of them, they're probably specified in the design. Does that procurement fall to the contractor, or are those actually purchased under some agreements like you were describing earlier with the hospital, and they're kind of delivered to site and then handed over? Not usually by the contractor. It's usually the client or the tenant that's procuring those pieces of equipment. And predominantly because a lot of that equipment has long lead times and you have to place orders well before you've got a contractor even on board. We'll include in contracts obligations or responsibilities that the contractor has around some of that equipment. Like they might be responsible for ensuring that the infrastructure or the power or whatever it is in the correct location, or they may even be responsible for skating in or bringing in a larger piece of equipment and positioning it in place. But generally the procurement of that equipment would be by the client, sometimes assisted by a consultant or even ourselves to sort of manage that procurement, but purchase itself is by them.
Yeah. And when is it the responsibility of the contractor, and when is it still the responsibility of the owner? And like, when does that handover occur? Is that like it's stored in a warehouse, it's off some materials off site, but now it's the responsibility of the contractor? Or is it when it's delivered to site? Because this is an expensive piece of kit. What's that line? That line?
Yeah, well, it's usually always the client's responsibility. To be honest, we wouldn't subtract it. Our exit.
Even if it's
it'd usually if it's ready early, it'd be delivered off site and stored somewhere until the contractor's ready. The space is ready for it to be brought in. Yeah. And generally, that's right at the death of construction or even after construction's completed. There's usually an operational commissioning or a period post practical completion where some of this equipment gets installed, commissioned, tested before it goes operational.
Have you had any examples of where that maybe was mishandled by the client or the contractor, or perhaps a procurement item should have been handled by the contractor and not the client? Have you got any examples where that went wrong?
Good question. Nothing major, to be honest, because we've always taken a fair bit of time and care with the development of what we call the FF&E schedule, which identifies who's responsible for the procurement and installation of that equipment. Usually it's only fixed equipment that we might pass on responsibility to the contractor to supply and install. Loose equipment or major medical equipment would almost always, the responsibility would sit with the client, because it could otherwise go very wrong. You want to, they're builders at the end of the day. They're not biomedical engineers. They're not going to take the care in managing a team that's building an MRI machine.
Yeah, that's right. And I guess to some degree, when you'll go out to the market with the documents that you kind of shared earlier, you'll be probably using, if it's a DNC, like a 4902 or maybe like a 2124, and then hopefully you get 3 responses. I'm not sure what the market is like for these kind of complex hospital facilities. And then to that point on the experience, are you assessing in a 2-envelope system here, like where you're kind of looking at price and non-price separately? And then are you looking really quite deep at the CVs and the experience of those people, and have they delivered a facility like this in the past? So they do have some kind of baseline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Baseline of knowledge.
And particularly on government facilities. So you've got the Queensland government procurement policy that you have to comply with. So that makes it quite straightforward. You have to assess the non-price elements of a submission first before you even look at the price. And depending on the risks, again, I know I keep going back to that, we'll look to, with the client, come up with a list of criteria and weightings around that criteria. So if it's a highly complex, high-risk project, the non-price criteria would significantly outweigh price. So yeah, for these larger, more complex spaces, projects, non-price, their experience, having done it before, having done similar facilities and projects before, and their understanding of the project, demonstrating an understanding of the risks is a key piece to it.
Do you see anything innovative these days with the responses, or is it still fairly just long, glossy tender docs? Or how are you seeing contractors kind of sell themselves?
It did. It's not something that we've seen.
So if you see that, then, and you are then bidding, I mean, do you do much bidding for your work, or are you getting? So you'll have to bid. You can kind of add value through those experiences. That's something you can reuse.
Yeah,
when you're going back to your clients.
Yeah, absolutely. We do exactly the same thing. We've got to submit tenders for a lot of our projects, or at least the government ones anyway. We've got some really good clients where they come sole source to us because they know that they're going to get a good outcome.
Best kind of work.
Yep, they're the best types of clients, but no, governments have to comply with that procurement policy and go out to a number of tenderers, and non-price is part of that process as well. So being able to demonstrate our understanding of the project, what those risks are, how we would manage them, and demonstrate our experience in similar facilities of projects.
Yeah, big
part of it.
I've always tried in trying to help PM firms with that. It's always interesting if you can boil down what you've done to an ROI, and then figure out what the ROI is of, say, specialized versus maybe another PM firm. So like if you were to aggregate all of your projects that you've delivered, on average, specialized deliver, 10% under budget, to use a bad example, but it's really difficult to work out what the ROI is from the past experience, because a lot of the time the project's over budget. But there is a tremendous amount of value that the client-side PM firm adds through the project, but because it's an opportunity cost, it's hard to necessarily manifest that back at the start.
It's always hard. It's something we've been talking about I've been talking about for 20 years. It's how do you actually demonstrate that value, because we try and mitigate those risks up front before they even happen. So how do you demonstrate that
how do you put a price on that?
You've saved a client 3 months or $1 million when that never actually happened in material.
When it never actually happened.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So I haven't seen anyone do that ROI thing really well, but I reckon it is possible to do if you had enough of the data.
Yeah.
So sounds like you don't have any trouble winning work though. So we do well, but it's difficult. It's a challenging market at the moment with the escalation in not only construction costs, but the day-to-day living expenses as well. It's putting a bit of a hold on projects and slowing things down quite a bit at the moment. So totally. Just got a couple more questions for you, Gordon, but I was just interested. We didn't talk too much about through the construction stage. Now, once the contractor's appointed, you're obviously providing contract admin, superintendency under the contract, if that's the term that contract is using. For AS4902, I think it is superintendent.
Yeah.
What's your kind of role then on site? Are you actually trying with these complex projects? Doesn't seem like it's a one day a fortnight, type thing.
No.
It seems like something that is more proactive, specifically for these kind of hospital health style projects. What does that look like for you in the construction phase?
Yeah, well, you're right. It's definitely more than once a fortnight for the high risk complex one. Even I keep talking about CSSDs, they're not big projects. The total value of some of these CSSD projects range from sort of $2 to $8 million. So they're not 50, 100, $200 million projects by any means. And any other project at that scale, you'd probably be expected to be out on site once a fortnight. But CSSD or a theatre or medical imaging facility, a lot can go wrong. So our team would generally be, it's not every day, but it'd be out several times a week, and particularly during high risk periods of construction.
Yeah. Have you ever gone to site in one of these instances and as the PM picked up something like fairly major, whether it was like, a defect that was just waiting to get identified, or a huge safety incident, or some operational risk that was kind of on the edge of being realized? Have you kind of got maybe a bad memory there that you could share?
What's a good example? We've been out on site when contractors or a contractor has demolished or cut through a wall and hit a water pipe, and that's obviously released a whole heap of water which has flowed into clinical spaces below, which can create a whole range of issues. So that's probably the first one that comes front of mind. But there's always issues that we're picking up with looking at ceiling space, voids.
Yeah.
Having ductwork sitting too low, for example, or having dead legs in plumbing pipe work, which bring leaks at risk.
What's a dead leg?
It's just a length of pipe, plumbing pipe, which doesn't have an outlet at the end of it. So,
right.
Yeah. So you get in any normal project, you'll have multiple dead legs. Or particularly in refurbishment projects, you'd be cutting off an outlet and you'd just leave it, cap it, leave it. But that in a hospital environment creates a risk of Legionella. So you can't leave dead legs throughout a hospital build. You've got to bring it all the way back to completely remove those elements.
Right. You've taught me, so I've learned why hospitals are so cold. I didn't know. And I've learned what a dead leg is and why you can't have a dead leg in a hospital. Have you got is there any others like that in your kitty there? Like why are the floors of hospitals always vinyl or something like that? I mean,
well, that's vinyl's an infection control, cleanliness thing again.
Yeah.
Like, you can imagine all the drama that happens in a medical ward if you have carpet, blood,
it has to be
feces, urine, all sorts of stuff that are staining that carpet. So it has to be clean. Yeah.
Oh, that's funny. Well, I might leave you with a question here, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I was going to ask you, like, what's the most underrated document in a construction project? But I think you would say probably the risk register.
Mm-hmm.
But I might ask you instead, like, you've been in this industry a long time. Do you hold any like unpopular opinion or like contrarian view that you feel strongly about?
It's a tough one. I don't know, to be honest. You kind of stumped me there. Look, it's probably not an answer to your question, but I've always held out for. I've been hoping there's no such thing as a perfect project, right? There's always going to be some issue that happens through the course of a project, something that was unexpected. But I've always held out hope that the client will allow me, and it's never happened in my nearly 20-year career, allow me or allow us to fully run a project the way we think it should be. Best possible outcome. And in my opinion, the best way to do that would be when you're looking to appoint consultants rather than using a large multidisciplinary firm where you might get a really good mechanical engineer and an average electrical engineer and a terrible hydraulic engineer. Going out and appointing the best of each discipline and then going through a fully documented design process. And by that, I don't just mean the level of design that we produce these days, where you're going to get a million variations and the delays that come along with it. I mean, an actual fully documented design, which is peer reviewed, they might take 50% more time to complete the level of detail, ensure there's that coordination between all the different engineering disciplines and the architect, and then ultimately produce a bill of quantities, a guaranteed bill of quantities, which is very rarely done in today's industry to provide to a contractor to build from.
Is that?
I think that can really effectively, it might cost more in that design phase. Well, not might, it will. It'll cost substantially more in the design phase, but the saving is in time to the builder and the minimising risk of cost of variations during that construction phase, and just not happening these days.
That is a fairly contrarian view. Like, I think most people would think that is just a perfection that just like would never exist, because there was like to have like a variationless construction stage would almost mean everything like has to stay static so you can actually execute.
Yeah, and like I said, there's no such thing as perfect projects, so there would still be variations, but it's about hitting that level of design that minimises to as much as possible.
Yeah.
These days, compared to when I first started in the industry, I was involved in a few projects that had guaranteed bill of quantities, and the level of documentation. Yeah, the level of documentation was far superior to what is done these days, and the amount of variations that come out because of it is very minimal. Construction time frames reduce as well then, because everybody knows what they're building. It's fully coordinated. You've got construction details that are actually considered rather than copy and paste from another project.
Yeah.
It's just spending more time planning and developing that design. Ultimately, I feel, and I've never been able to do it myself, is going to get a better outcome for everybody.
Yeah. So why did if you've got a couple more minutes, why has that gone backwards? Because everybody talked about BIM this, BIM's going to change the world, but never really manifested the way I think people had hoped. You're kind of suggesting it's gone backwards a bit from an era of quality that had less variations and whatnot. What do you think has caused that?
I think it's just competitiveness in the market. Really, it's a race to the bottom in consulting world. There should be a far higher weighting on experience and capability than price.
Yes.
But price, at the end of the day, always is a major factor.
Yes.
And you're not going to win any work if you're providing a tender proposal that has a properly fully documented design when somebody else is pricing one that they're saying is fully documented and might only be 80 or 90% or copy and paste construction details from the last project that they did. So,
so the message for clients there would be, be wary of, I guess, having the wool pulled over your eyes with kind of some of these, I guess they are kind of lies to a degree. But it is, that is hard for them to see through that when sometimes they're not sophisticated industry professionals themselves, which is then hard to educate them through a tender and then hard to sell them on the value.
Exactly. And then
when they just look at the price.
Question about ROI, how do you actually show that you've saved them that cost when it never even happened in the first place?
That's right. Yeah. Well, I think in this video, I've learned a lot. I had all these other questions to ask you, but I enjoyed going deep on that topic. It's clear your stuff around these hospital and health projects. And so back to the very start, like why couldn't someone do one of these projects? Why are they different? You're so right in what you said. It's crazy amount of risk, and you have to have had experience in those exact risk scenarios to be able to properly mitigate them or navigate them and even just eliminate them at the start of the project. And that's really valuable to a client, and that's worth something. But and then how do you convert that into an ROI?
Absolutely. We wouldn't have a job if anybody could do it.
That's right. Yeah, very cool. Well, thanks a lot, Gordon. That was super interesting. Yeah, thank you for that.
I appreciate it. It was fun.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you want to know more about construction and get all the professional tips, tricks, and AI advice from real construction project managers, follow this channel for more insights.